Hi guys, so in this paper 3 video, unit 6.2, we're going to look at the effects of increasing agricultural productivity on biodiversity. Throughout this IB course, we've had a look at the importance of biodiversity and its relationship to the number of resources that we use. So we've seen that there is a large effect of industrial agricultural systems on the environment. An important subset of these environmental impacts are the impact on biodiversity. Biodiversity was referred to by one of the last videos we looked at when they were looking at farming in Iowa. Specifically, monocultures are very vulnerable to environmental change, to pests and diseases, and also they place excessive strain on the structure of the soil. Because of this, they require the intensive application of chemicals, herbicides, fungicides, etc., and the extensive use of large amounts of fertilizer. This will affect the structure of the soil, and as we've seen before, as well as the structure of the soil being affected, it will increase the chances of soil erosion and soil degradation. It would also affect the micro and macro flora and fauna of the soil. So we have a look at this video, which gives us a perspective on pesticides, which is an important part of the modern farming method.
Each day, there are 200,000 new mouths to feed across the world, and by 2050, the global population will have reached 9 billion. This places an ever-increasing strain on food production and supply. According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the world must produce 60% more food to meet this demand. Farming cannot stand still.
Okay, so with the agricultural imperative, you know that that is a very, very important and challenging thing as we move towards 2050. So farming cannot stand still. If we carry on farming in the way that we are, or even worse, went back to organic, less intensive farming methods, we simply would not be able to produce enough food. 200,000 new mouths. That's a lot of people to feed.
Modern methods are critical to providing a safe, affordable and sustainable supply of food. But it's important that we minimise the...
Okay, so there, as we've seen all the way in particular through the Food and Health Unit, the importance of food security. Modern agriculture has an absolute vital role, and pesticides have a significant role in ensuring that food production can keep pace with population growth and growing demand. But of course, as we're going to look at, there is the other side, which is striking a balance with the environment.
The impact of food production on the environment and on wildlife. The use of modern crop protection technologies, such as pesticides, allows us to maximise the productivity of existing agricultural land, so leaving uncropped land as habitats for wildlife. To look at it another way, traditional and lower input approaches to farming, such as organic, produce significantly lower yields than modern methods. So, to produce the same amount of food, we would need to use more of the land that currently supports biodiversity. UK farmers are amongst the best in the world at producing food while protecting habitats and wildlife. And that's no surprise. It's in their interest to ensure the long-term future of the land on which they rely for their and their families' livelihoods. In recent years, UK farmers have, for instance, planted or restored approximately 30,000 kilometres of hedgerows to provide food and shelter for wildlife. And innovation in crop protection has meant they continue to be able to protect their crops from pests, weeds and diseases, while the amount of pesticides applied has decreased by 71% from 1990. Farmers are even using modern technologies to boost the biodiversity and wildlife of uncropped land. Precision mapping allows farmers to identify less productive areas, which can be set aside for biodiversity. Targeted use of herbicides can then help establish strips of pollen-rich flowers to produce a habitat more attractive to bees and other insects. So, far from being detrimental to the environment, the ever-increasing demand for food means modern farming is critical to our ability to maintain biodiversity and wildlife. Let's make the land we use as productive as possible so we can protect as well as feed our planet. Let's keep pesticides in perspective.
Okay, as with all of these things, you need to understand who produced that video. It is a special interest group. It is the Crop Protection Association, and guess what? They do produce pesticides, but it does raise important issues. So it's saying, there is a balance, and by use of the pesticides and use of this agricultural technology, as we said before, what it does mean is that you can actually use less land to produce more food. And that has big potential impacts on protecting biodiversity, particularly biodiversity in existing ecosystems. Okay, so we're going to go on to look at food miles. We've spent some time looking at food miles, so we're going to go through food miles very, very quickly in this video. You know what food miles are. We'll watch this video through. Okay, I'm not sure if I actually believe those numbers, but it does get you to have a think about the concept of food miles. So as we know, food miles is the distance that the food has travelled before ultimately it's purchased or consumed. Now, of course, there is a relationship there between food miles and the environmental footprint of the food, but it's not a clear-cut relationship. You cannot just look at the number of food miles that it travels. You need to think about the mode of transport and the efficiency of that transport. And also another thing to take into consideration is if you're growing tomatoes, for example, in a heated greenhouse in a cold climate, that's going to be a large carbon footprint to heat the greenhouse for those tomatoes. You actually end up with a lot smaller overall carbon footprint if you grow those tomatoes in a hot climate and bring them over by an efficient transportation method. So this relationship between food miles and the ecological footprint of the produce that we eat is not as simple or clear-cut. You need to watch this video in conjunction with the website so you can see the information here about food miles. We've started to think then about the calorific content of food and how many calories we obtain from the food and how many calories or how much energy it costs to produce that food. So that is one way that we are looking at things. But then, those vast distances the food travels from plough to plate, or however you like to look at it, is not always, it is quite often very, very bad. There are sometimes better alternatives, but there is a high dependence on fossil fuels. So something for you to consider. Okay, next up, we're going to have a look at the case study of water and flowers in Kenya. In the Food and Health unit, of course, we've looked at the concept of virtual water. So again, we are just revisiting a lot of the content that we've looked at before, but this time it's with the lens or with the view of its relationship to globalization.